A swarm of Ukrainian sea drones powered by jet skis has sunk yet another Russian warship in the Black Sea, as Britain's defence intelligence appears to confirm that Russia has used a new type of hypersonic missile for the first time in the war in Ukraine.
Kyiv again, and this is a scene of yet. We're in Kyiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We'll start with the extraordinary footage released by Ukraine's military intelligence appearing to show a swarm of sea drones hitting a Rapucha-class landing ship near the southern tip of Crimea. This comes about 2 weeks after a similar attack. It brings to at least 22 the number of Russian warships that have been damaged or destroyed, including a submarine, in both airstrikes and attacks by sea drones over the course of almost 2 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The footage appears to show a number of these drones approaching the Caesar Kunikov, a Rapucha-class landing ship. Now, these are ships about 112 metres long that can carry up to 10 main battle tanks and 340 infantry. They are designed to facilitate a sort of D-Day style landing. Ukraine has destroyed at least 4 of these. We know it's also hit a number of Russian warships. Of course, most notably was the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea fleet, that was hit by a volley of 2 Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles in April 2022, a few months into the war. But since then, and indeed before then, we'd seen attacks against the Caesar Kunikov when it was in port in Berdyansk. It survived that attack. We've seen attacks as far east in the Black Sea as Novorossiysk, where another Rapucha landing ship was hit in a similar circumstances by what appeared to be sea drones. We've also seen the Storm Shadow cruise missiles provided by the UK, and possibly the Scalp cruise missiles, the same missile, the French name for the same missile provided by France, hitting a number of targets, maritime targets in Crimea. That includes the Kilo-class submarine, the Rostov-on-Don. There was the Minsk, both those hit in dry dock in Sebastopol, a strike further east in Feodosia, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and of course also a strike on Russia's Black Sea naval headquarters in Sebastopol. So we're staying with this for a while because this has been an area, these strikes against Russian naval assets have been an area where Ukraine, perhaps the area where Ukraine has scored the most significant successes over the last year. We've also seen reports in the last few days that Ukrainian special forces had retaken an oil platform in the Black Sea, which they said Russia was using for surveillance. What has gone in concert with both the airstrikes and the strikes by these naval drones have been deliberate attempts to knock out Russia's air defences and surveillance systems, because by knocking out those defences, those early warning systems, it appears to have allowed Ukraine's attacks to get through. Now, overall, the result of these strikes, it's not regaining Ukraine territory on the ground, but what it has done is it has forced Russia to relocate most of its Black Sea warships further east, from Crimea towards Novorossiysk in the eastern edge of the Russian Black Sea. Now, as I mentioned, there has been a strike that far east, which shows nowhere is really safe. But effectively, by depleting Russia's maritime defences around occupied Crimea, it is leaving that peninsula potentially more vulnerable to attacks. And Ukraine has repeatedly said that it would like to clear Russian forces out of all of the territory it occupies, including areas like Crimea and the eastern parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, which were first occupied in 2014, as well as the territory which has been captured more recently since 2022. The other news this week is that Ukraine has said it has detected evidence of a Zircon hypersonic missile. Now, this would be the first time Russia has fired a hypersonic missile. It was reportedly fired at the capital, Kyiv, on February the 7th, but the news just released a couple of days ago, and today it appears to have been confirmed in the latest update from Britain's defence intelligence. It's not the first time Russia has used hypersonic missiles. They've used their Kinzhal, also the Dagger missile, many, many times, but Ukraine has said that they have successfully shot the Kinzhals down with American-supplied Patriot air defence batteries. The Zircon is similar in many ways. It travels at about Mach 9, 9 times the speed of sound, and it is designed to be able to maneuver at speed like the Kinzhal to try and evade air defence systems. But actually, it has a much shorter range. Originally designed as an anti-ship missile to be fired off Russian ships, whereas the Kinzhal designed to be fired off aircraft, and that's part of the reason the Kinzhal has a longer range. The Zircon has a range of about 1,000 kilometres, but it can fly lower, designed to evade anti-ship defences, or rather ship defences. And the British Minister of Defence warning that if this is confirmed, then it would be a significant challenge to Ukraine's air defences because of both this missile's speed and manoeuvrability. The MOD, the UK MOD, suggesting that they suspect Russia has modified a K300 air defence battery. That's effectively a large lorry that has 2 tubes on its back to fire missiles, modified one of these K300s in order to be able to fire these Zircon missiles. That may be a Russian response to try and use new missiles, new weapons, to make up for the fact that it's been depleting its stockpiles of other weapons, particularly its stockpiles of advanced weapons. This week, the think tank, the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, said that it believed Russia had lost more than 3,000 tanks over the last 2 years. That was the equivalent of its entire pre-war active service fleet, and it's been drawing much older equipment out of its stockpiles to try and replenish itself on the battlefield. Meanwhile, Ukraine has managed to replenish much of its battlefield losses with Western donated equipment. So Ukraine has been replacing old kit with new Western kit, whereas Russia has been replacing some of its best, most advanced equipment with old Soviet equipment from storage. The other news we'll talk about today is that since our last update, President Zelensky of Ukraine has removed his commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, as commander of Ukraine's armed forces, and he's replaced him with General Alexander Syrsky, who was before the commander of Ukraine's land forces. So effectively, in British lingo, that would be the chief of defence staff, the head of all the armed forces, being replaced by the head of the army. This has been a long time coming. Valery Zaluzhny, the commander who has been removed, is hugely popular in Ukraine. He's largely seen as the man who masterminded the defense of Kyiv, indeed the defense of Ukraine, and which led to significant Ukrainian victories in that first year of the war. Of course, if you remember, there was the Russian retreat from Kyiv in March and April, just a month and a bit into the invasion. Then later that year, we saw the lightning advance by Ukrainian forces around Kharkiv in the northeast as Russian troops collapsed. And then later that year, we saw Russia retreat from parts of occupied Kherson province, which have since been taken by Ukraine. But since then, there haven't really been any really major significant movements on the battlefield. Many soldiers have been killed. We've seen huge losses in that grinding assault for Bakhmut. So it's a similar story in Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. And indeed, Russia continues its attempts to advance around Kupiansk in the northeast. Hopefully, we'll see from this decision that they will draw a line under these simmering tensions. When I interviewed President Zelensky at the end of last year, in November, I asked him specifically about relations with Zaluzhny, and he was very direct. He said that generals who get involved in politics get destroyed. He didn't really try to hide the bad blood between those two men, but hopefully this will allow the presidency and indeed allow the armed forces to draw a line under that conflict. And General Syrsky, who has been immensely experienced, who's been playing a key role in the fight so far, will continue Ukraine's campaign to liberate its territory from Russian occupation. The only other story today that I want to look at quickly is reports that Russian soldiers have been using Starlink satellites. The Starlink system, owned by Elon Musk, has been immensely helpful to Ukraine. I spent time with Ukrainian soldiers who have the Starlink terminals strapped to the top of their vehicles or concealed, but in their bases, forward positions, bunkers. It allows them to communicate at speed with sort of satellite-based internet. But Elon Musk has remained a slightly controversial figure in Ukraine because there have been reports that when Ukraine was trying to use these satellites to launch attacks, for example, against Crimea, that the satellite system was turned off and suddenly they lost contact, for example, with the sorts of maritime drones they've been using to attack ships. Now suggestions that Russian forces also have access to the same technology. Officially, Starlink does not trade with Russia, but Ukrainian officials suggesting that these terminals have been supplied by third countries, by Arab states, to Russian forces. Officially, the Kremlin is denying this. It says that Starlink systems are not authorized for use by Russian forces. Thank you very much for your questions. If you are watching on YouTube, please do ask your questions in the comments below and we'll endeavor to answer them next week. First question today is, why are people in Russia putting up with this war? It's a really good question because, from Ukraine's point of view, from the West's point of view, this appears like an act of deliberate and horrific Russian aggression against an innocent country, an innocent neighbor, Ukraine. It's a really complicated question, so I'll try and answer it as simply as possible and as best as I can. But of course, I'm not in Russia. In fact, I'm banned from Russia. But the first point is that Russians, the information they get inside Russia is relatively limited. The Kremlin has a very tight grip on Russian media. They are fed a diet of Moscow-controlled Kremlin propaganda, and that describes this war as a war to reclaim Russia's past glory, its rightful territories. Vladimir Putin does not see Ukraine as a legitimate sovereign country. Rather, he sees it as a sort of missing limb of Russia that was severed in 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. Putin claims it's subsequently been taken over by Nazi. These claims are ridiculous, but nonetheless, these are the claims that are promulgated in Russia. Of course, we did see a failed uprising by Wagner forces. We have seen some dissent inside Russia, but interestingly, that dissent, the most vocal dissent, actually comes from people who think that Moscow and its armed forces are not being violent or aggressive enough. The protests that you might expect to see from the families, the loved ones of the soldiers have happened, but there's been sort of fairly quick police crackdowns. They have been limited. They so far haven't managed to really create a tidal shift in public opinion. But nonetheless, that is something that Ukraine continues to try and chip away at. And one of the reasons that Ukraine continues to launch sabotage attacks deep inside Russian territory is to try and bring the war home to ordinary Russian people, to make them realize what is happening. Question number 2 is, what are the relative costs of missiles versus warships? It's another great question. And of course, it's been quite relevant, not just in Ukraine, but also in the Red Sea, where we've seen American and British warships using incredibly sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles to intercept relatively cheap drones, Houthi rebel drones fired from Yemen, supplied by Iran. In that case, in that example, people suggesting that the missiles being used cost around £1 million, the drones cost a few hundred, few thousand pounds. Of course, the equation that the military planners are looking at is not really the cost of the drone in that case, but rather the cost of the merchant vessel that could be sunk or destroyed with its cargo, and that is being protected by the missile. In a military sense, obviously it varies enormously depending on the missile and the warship. There were estimates when the Rostov-on-Don, a Kilo-class Russian submarine, was sunk in Sebastopol, that was worth between about 350 million US dollars. We understand that was probably hit, almost certainly hit, by a British-supplied Storm Shadow missile. Suggestions that costs around $2 to $2.5 million. So in that sense, potentially good value for money. Warships do vary enormously. I mean, the two British aircraft carriers, the largest and most expensive vessels built for the Royal Navy, or at least largest and most expensive surface vessels built for the Royal Navy, estimates that they cost around £3.2 billion. Britain's nuclear submarines, some estimates suggest they cost £4 billion each. But Russia's fleet, much of Russia's fleet in the Black Sea is much older, and historically Russia has produced its weaponry far more cheaply than countries like Britain and indeed NATO allies. The final question is why do Russia's warships appear so vulnerable to these attacks? And it's a really good one to end on because it brings us back to where we started. It's a number of reasons. First of all, as I've mentioned before, Ukraine has been taking out Russian air defences, radars and early warning systems in order to try and leave these ships and indeed the headquarters in Sebastopol vulnerable to strikes. We have seen Russia trying to use different techniques to defeat the sea drone attacks. Indeed, there have been an instance where Russian helicopters have been scrambled and they've been trying to shoot the drones as they approach the boats. In this latest footage of the Caesar Kunikov being hit, the drone footage appeared to show a couple of Russian sentries on the prow of the boat, possibly looking out for these drones. But it's also worth pointing out that these drones are new technology, and the Group 13 from Ukraine's GUR military intelligence unit, which is conducting these strikes, is very proud of the fact, it sort of boasts about the fact they are using cutting-edge technology. And it appears to be one of these moments in conflict where a new style of weapon is leapfrogging ahead of existing defences. But it is a constant evolution, and as Ukraine continues to use these drones, we'll expect to see Russia evolving its defences, and again Ukraine will need to look for new ways of sidestepping or overcoming those. Thank you again, as always, for watching or listening. If you've been listening to this as a podcast, then please don't forget to subscribe wherever you get that podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, then please don't forget to subscribe, to like and subscribe to The Sun, and if you have any questions, do ask them in the comments below and we'll try and answer them next time. Thank you.